Welcome to Face to Face. I'm your host, Chris Cook, and joining me tonight is Larry Wartel. Welcome to the program, Larry. Now, Larry is a stalwart progressive activist and perennial participant at the many meetings and manifestations in Victoria. His training is in urban planning, while his first passion is promoting social justice and environmental protection. He's also a proponent of prison abolition and transformative organizing. Well, welcome, Larry. Our current societal paradigm is starting to show cracks, and it's clear that within the next few years we're going to have to do something different in the way we live our lives. Now, Larry, what is transformative organization, and how can it help us make that transformation into the new paradigm?
Transformative organizing leads to a transformative organization, hopefully. It means that we change ourselves in the process of direct interaction with people, overcoming our shyness, our inhibitions, and getting out into the community and organizing around meaningful issues that are very tangible to people, that directly and immediately impact people in their daily lives. Signing people up, in other words, getting their names and phone numbers on a piece of paper right out in the streets or in the places of work, and beginning to create places where people can feel safe and comfortable and trusting of others to come and start meeting and making the plans for change.
Well, and that's important because we have been trained, it seems to me, to become, rather than participants, to become voyeurs of the political process. Well, first of all, what is it that made you make that transition from being, like the rest of us, couch sitters or maybe sideline critics, and to go out into the street clipboard in hand, or to go knocking on those doors to engage people and try to get them off the sofa?
I'm still 82% couch potato. But it was being exposed when I lived in Los Angeles to people who had long histories of direct contact with people in the movements they were building. Cesar Chavez, Eric Mann, the Bus Riders Union, the United Farm Workers. I had wonderful experiences with them as they took me by the hand and showed me what it was and surrounded me with love and empathy, and then nudged me gently to get out and connect with people, because I was a very shy guy myself for most of my life, and I just observed and voyeured, as you say.
Well, the Bus Riders Union, and Eric Mann, is he the original author of this transformative manifesto?
The great book is Playbook for Progressives, and it's the 16 qualities of the successful organizer, and it's a very practical and meaningful and relevant look at what we need to do to change ourselves and begin to create the organizations that will change society.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Los Angeles, and of course, bus riding in Los Angeles is sort of reserved for the very lowest of the low on the social order. It's not seen as being a progressive or environmentally friendly thing to do. It's like where people that have no car, which is, the least of the society, go to. This concept of a bus riders union, where did that grow out of?
That baffled me for the longest time because of my privilege. I didn't really understand it. I never had to ride buses myself. Eric understood that with the great changes, the shutdown of the factories where people had stable places to organize between the 30s and the 60s, and then with capitalist globalization and deindustrialization, people were scattered to the winds in the big urban centers, and yet they still rode the buses. Millions of working class people would meet regularly on the buses. So Eric coined the term the factory on wheels, and he realized that this is the place, the point of access, to begin to connect with people, sign them up, bring them into an organization, and begin to build the culture and the long-term philosophical and political objectives out of this organization, the Bus Riders Union.
Well, unionization, in the United States at least, in the 20th century, unionization was probably the single biggest social factor in bringing about the kind of prosperity that post-war America and Canada, to a lesser degree, enjoyed. Well, now they've deindustrialized largely in the States and to a large effect in Canada as well. And there isn't that space. The unions are weaker than they've ever been. What do you think the future of unionism is then? I mean, there's the Bus Riders Union, but what else? What other formats can the people organize and use as a rallying cry that the unions once provided?
Unions are still central. They need to begin to relearn their history and see themselves as being central to the grand organizing efforts that are going to have to occur long into the future of people in these disparate workplaces. So if unions reclaim and rekindle their sense of solidarity with the non-union workers in society, this will be a profound change in itself, and Eric Mann works for this. But the changes will have to come in these disparate workplaces among tens, hundreds of millions of workers who are primarily at the lower edge of the middle class, which is a very constructed term with vacuous meaning most of the time, but it means low-income working class. And these people are the ones who are going to make the profound changes, just as people in factories made the profound changes in the 30s that led to the New Deal. So we're going to have people in an organization with both an ecological and a social justice imperative, and that is what the Bus Riders Union intends.
Well, and for the unemployed too. I mean, or the people that have 3 jobs, and they're working 4 hours here, 4 hours there, and commuting maybe, right across a town or city to get their 3rd job in just to pay a rent.
Yep, the casualization of labor, the precariousness of labor, all is dealt with within this concept of the Bus Riders Union. But the most immediate aim is to facilitate the ease of access just to get back and forth to work, to recreation, and to places of food and shopping. Hopefully not so much shopping. But in the process, again, it's transformative organizing. In the process of bringing people into the Bus Riders Union, they adjust their values as they see their old values of consumerism are no longer compatible to a meaningful life. But reclaiming values of justice and compassion, empathy, reconnection with in their families, in their neighborhoods. All of these values are questioned within the Bus Riders Union in the long struggle to ultimately create the political power for reclaiming economic justice, first and foremost, then social justice, ecological justice. The Bus Riders Union they call for automobile abolition. So in that process, they're saying 1,000 buses, 1,000 less jails, 1,000 less police, 1,000 more buses, and attach whatever 1,000 you feel is necessary to that word that would lead towards ecological change.
1,000 more community farms.
Absolutely.
Well, there's a term that's been recently coined in the UK called the precariat. And the writer that came up with that compared that to the la bohème, the lowest of the low in the social order preceding the French Revolution. And now people, if they want to call themselves the middle class, I think these are the people that have roofs over their heads, but below them there's the threat. They're an inch away from becoming the precariat, where 1 or 2 paychecks missed means they slide into homelessness.
Yeah, that's a powerful word, the precariat. And again, the only way we're going to eliminate this and make ecological changes to stop carbon dependency is by having 100 million workers, 150, 180 million workers in organizations that can demand an end to carbon dependency. Local farms is so critical to the initiative. And having public transit with cities that are free of cars. And all of these are the fundamental objectives and visions and dreams of the Bus Riders Union. But first and foremost, it's free buses, 1,000 more buses, and buses that run much more frequently for people. So then eventually people who have privilege and comfort and riding around by the tens of millions on LA's highways in all of our urban centers can eventually leave their cars at home, abandon their cars, and jump on the bus one day.
Well, LA is a signature city in a lot of ways, and counter to the whole direction, it seems to me at least, where society is going in the 21st century, Western society. It's more indicative maybe is Paris with its arrondissement systems, the circle of rings, where the very center of the city is where the highest property values and the richest people live. They don't need buses or even the metro. They can walk around largely. But exiled to the suburbs are the working class, the people that do need transit. And this is where we see cuts. I mean, we see this system taking form in Vancouver. We see it here in Victoria, where the densification, as it's called here, means more and more condominiums in the downtown core and higher property values and rents that drive the workers and the people that aren't working further and further away. And yet those buses aren't forthcoming. And even if they were, would there be anything for them in these cities of the future?
Beautiful articulation, Chris. I love the way you put it. Let's trade seats. Absolutely. It's obviously very and deeply aligned to where a class of people are within the working class. Privileged working class people have the freedom to stay in their cars and live in the immediate edges of the city where property values may be higher, but the lower property values we see are increasingly in the far reaches, the suburbs, where people are forced onto increasingly defunded transit because the automobile gets massive amounts of subsidy and public transit gets minimal amounts of subsidy. So people are on the buses, on public transit, even if you have rail-based transit, which the Bus Riders Union has identified as a theft from buses, because buses can more quickly get people out of their cars more readily and free people from automobile dependency than fixed rail routes can anywhere in the world. So as a class-based issue, it's very important to stop that subsidy going to the cars and stop the subsidy going to heavy and light rail, which benefit the developers and the realtors, and begin to make the demands that the money go back into the buses so we can one day have free buses, enough buses, running all hours of the day and night for people to access their basic needs of existence.
Well, it seems counterintuitive in these days that somebody would, especially someone with your background in urban planning, would be advocating buses over rail, because we traditionally hear that the other way around, as rail being much more environmentally friendly. But we have a long history in this country, and the United States too, and Britain before it, I expect, of the rail acting as a conduit for economic expansion, and the people, the rail barons and their friends being the ones that are the first to know. The BC rail fiasco comes jumping immediately to mind. But as an urban planner, Larry, here in Victoria, we've got some very unique set of circumstance and problems in the way the city has been growing rapidly, and we're squeezed onto the very narrow point of an island with not very much area to grow except for north. How do you think Victoria is faring so far in its densification as an urban planning model? And is there a better way?
Unfortunately, we have the same pressures in Victoria, the pressure from the developer and the realtor class to continually to maximize the highest best use of the land that they own and want to accumulate. And they see light rail at this time as a benefit by putting down these fixed rail routes, which will increase the property values along the key automobile conduits that we see are so congested. And what would fix it immediately, what would decongest Victoria and Capital Region? Massive investment that's now going to the automobile and intended to go into light rail, back into the buses. Let's have 50 more buses. Let's call for free buses. Let's run them 24 hours where appropriate. And let's make them clean fuel. Let's make them smaller when necessary so they can go into the neighborhoods, so neighborhoods don't feel intimidated by them. And this will allow people to get out of their cars and enhance the amenities that we already have. We're a pedestrian and we're a bicycle-friendly city already. This would make it so much safer for bicycles if we had buses. There would actually be less conflict between big buses just by getting 40, 50, 60% of the people out of the cars by investing more heavily into the bus system.
Well, we've seen, we're a tourist city here in Victoria as well, and we have very cramped communities like James Bay especially, that bears the brunt of the cruise ship industry, and these great massive highway buses that are navigating the narrow streets. There was a woman killed crossing a street last tourist season. No doubt that's going to be a situation repeated as we see the number of these buses increase and the areas where they have access to seem to increase as well. How does a city, from an urban planning point of view, how do they manage when the busyness of the city changes so radically in the in and off seasons?
Again, we can moderate all the effects, but we have to have more representation, and we have to have enough people in an organization to make political, social, economic demands. So I'm just learning. I'm a baby learning to walk with all this myself. But the amazing thing that the book teaches us is that you got to have a dues-paying or a dues-based organization where people feel a real bond to it, and they feel an economic commitment to it by paying their dues. And this leads to creating political demand, a sense of political ownership over the organization, which eventually translate into political representation and then greater political demands on the system at large. So a bus riders union in Victoria we would actively train our organizers to go out and sign people up on the buses, get that 14% of the public that's riding on buses up to 20, 30, 40% of the public. And that's where you can begin to have fundamental political shifts that will observe the ecological needs as well of the community. Freeing up land from automobiles will free up so much more land for farming, and it would free up time within the workforce for people to begin to do farming again locally.
Yeah, we don't think of traditionally as the automobile as being subsidized, but every time you see a road crew, a city road crew out there, digging a ditch or slowing traffic down, that's a direct subsidy. This is coming out of tax money, and it's directed towards the automobile.
Yep, $2,000 to $6,000 a year for every car on the road through all of the immediate and indirect costs, injury, medical, insurance. It's an egregious waste of human energy and initiative. 20% of the global GNP is the automobile. Again, everything related. That would be the oil and the metal and the factories, the assembly lines and the medical costs. So all of the negative effects of the automobile are also part of that GNP, which are a real drag on humanity. So freeing people from the car the first step is the bus system. And I, again, as an urban planner, as a privileged white guy, I never really understood this until I studied the material from the Bus Riders Union over the last couple of years. And now this great book that's been written, Playbook for Progressives. Hopefully we'll get a picture of it up online when we finish our session.
Well, Larry, is that the fear then by those that resist this move away from the automobile, that all those statistics that you just said, like all the economic activity that surrounds the automobile, many argue that more than even the post-Second World War, that boom was fueled by automobiles and decentralized communities. The suburbs made America prosperous, and you seem to be saying that we should cut that away. I mean, doesn't that undermine any hope of an economic recovery?
We're going to send a lot of buses out to these burbs, and eventually we'll have trains too. I'm a passionate lover of trains. Taken for a Ride is a great online video that talks about the history of the derailing of North America, Taken for a Ride.
And Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
You got
your home city of Los Angeles. It outlines, like here in Victoria, we had streetcars at the turn of the last century. And in LA as well, it was well served, and after the war that disappeared. So
part of the economic revitalization of the capitalist world will inevitably have to come from a massive reinvestment in buses and eventually rail, appropriate rail. Once rail is no longer competitive under neoliberal and austerity conditions with the bus system, but that's how it is now. So we have to fight to have just subsidy, which would go into buses, because that serves the lowest of the working class, the lowest income of the working class, whereas rail generally serves more privileged communities, the condominium, high-rise communities that grow up along rail lines and the nodes that appear at the stations around rail systems.
Well, Vancouver is a perfect example of this, where you see Metrotown and other places along their elevated train system, but they're just these great towers of condominiums that the working people don't have access to and never will. But well, Larry, you're American. You're an American citizen and a Canadian as well. You go back and forth across the border, and for political purpose, not just for holidaying or seeing relatives. And you've been down in the States campaigning for President Obama in the past. When you talk about the neoliberal economy and the resistance to these changes, what's your take on the Obama administration after one completed term and entering the halfway mark of its second term?
I'm saddened but not paralyzed. It's totally understandable and predictable what's happening under Obama. He makes war. He wouldn't be there if he didn't make war. He steals billions and trillions of dollars of the taxpayers' money, hard-earned money, to make those wars. Not right. But he's better than the alternative. I'm a firm believer in that still. There's still lesser evil is still lesser evil. And things will begin to shift. And Obama gets this himself because he has an organizing history. And he said what the great President Roosevelt said, make me do it. In other words, people, if you want change, get out in the streets and start putting the pressure on all of the representatives in society within the political structure. And then I will be able to implement changes that you want to see, from defunding militarism to dramatic shifts in investment for ecological renewal and social justice all throughout the land. Obama gets this, but we don't see the mass movements that we're going to have before this can happen. Obama literally has a figurative and maybe a literal Saturday night special held to his head. If he gets out in front of where the power brokers are and begins to attempt to make these changes himself, without the people behind him. So it's both personal risk to Obama, but more importantly, there's just not the social pressure. And that will come through transformative organizing. When we, the organizers, or the leaders, and not in an egotistical sense are we leaders, but we see a problem in society. However, we have to transform ourselves to learn how to reconnect with masses of people in a systematic way before we can have the organizations that can move an Obama or even a Harper.
Well, any president has the example of John Kennedy to consider when they enter office. And of course, the American system is designed so that the president doesn't have all these powers, isn't a king, but there's checks and balances, unlike in Canada. But I wonder, though, about, the people have come out. In Canada, we've seen Idle No More, and also the Occupy movement in the States was large. But when demonstrations arrive at either the Democratic or Republican conventions or anywhere else, the new and almost accepted form, a reaction to that by the state, is mass police violence by an increasingly militarized police force. So when we say, well, if the people make me do it, says Mr. Obama, when the people go out into the streets to exercise and the only avenue they have left to them, the streets, look what they get: they get beatings and mass imprisonment, and no change.
It's easy to marginalize these beautiful spontaneous outbursts against injustice when they don't have a real deep core, a real deep bond within the working class. So transformative organizing is recreating that bond that existed until McCarthyism. Again, starting with the first simple step of signing up, systematically signing up. That means getting your notebook, your clipboard, and taking names and numbers on the sidewalks of bus riders, of co-workers, of people in your church if you're religious, people in the schools, signing people up into an organization and quietly building the base. And one day that base will have enough economic power to shut things down non-violently. And this is when police and state violence will be dramatically moderated. Because if you have, say in the Occupy movement or the Idle No More movement, or even the anti-globalization protests, you had maybe 0.5% of people at these protests. But if you have people in city after city in a federal organization that's based in the working class with the economic power and willingness to shut down their workplace, that's when you'll see dramatic resistance with the power to change things. And the power to moderate the retaliatory force against them.
So this sounds like a general strike to me.
Oh, of course.
Well, we've seen in Brazil now, right now, this is almost July of 2013, Brazil is hosting a big soccer tournament in preparation for the World Cup, the biggest soccer tournament there is. The people there are coming out into the streets to press their demands for things very much like what you're saying here. Public transit is a huge issue, and who knew that there was, tens of thousands getting into the streets because they want to ride better buses. What's your take on what's happening in Brazil? Is that a foreteller what we can expect here?
I have to do my Amy Goodman work on the coverage of Brazil. I hear it's been triggered by increases in the bus fares, the transit fares. It's broad-based, but the people in these organizations are making comprehensive demands on the state. And I have a sense that it's pushing back against the potential violence. Obviously, they have a social democratic leader. This woman was in prison herself. She has a deep sensitivity to what that means. But she's between a rock and the hard place of the Brazilian ruling class. So she has to appease them at the same time as giving credibility to the youthful forces in the streets. If they can engage the working class, then they'll get the upper hand, and I don't know. I have to learn more about whether or not that's happening.
Well, we're seeing all manner of reaction down there, and we've seen it up here too. There's a term diversity of tactics involved, and you were mentioning, a pacifist reaction. But some say, well, that's fine and good, but nobody pays attention to it. The press won't cover it because if it bleeds, it leads, and the politicians ignore what the press doesn't cover. But then on the other hand, when we have violence, more often than not, we see it's agents provocateurs sent in by the police, So where are you? Well, maybe you can explain a little better, Larry, what the diversity of tactics means and how we can respond to that.
We're not ready yet to, I believe in nonviolence. What Martin Luther King advocated and even Malcolm X at the end of his life is the path we must follow. Now, if we're attacked over and over again, as we see in the majority world, where the state invokes violence systematically, people definitely have the right to do whatever they need to defend their land, their family, their meager property, and their growing lands. We're not at that point yet. There is violence, but smashing glass is just going to provoke more violence. So the step between doing these, what I consider to be feel-good activities and relatively symbolic but still quite meaningless and even destructive and dangerous, the step in between is what we haven't done since McCarthyism, and that's relearning the tactics of organizing. And that means basic and simple loving outreach to millions of people. Going up to people, listening to them at their doorstep during elections and in between elections, in their places of work and on the streets, at the buses, what Eric Mann suggests in the book, listening to what they're concerned about. If you're a bus rider union organizer, you would say, I got to learn it myself, but I get the idea that you would say, I'm a volunteer with the bus riders union. We're building an organization that stands to that seeks free bus service, more accessible bus service. Can we sign you up for this? And if you ask 100 people, you'll get a response. You'll get people who will begin to give you their name and phone number and email or their cell phone number, and you'll be able to invite them to the next meeting. This is the step, as innocuous and seemingly meaningless as this sounds in the grand scheme of things, this is the step that's missing between violence from the diversity of tactics elements within the black anarchist communities and making real fundamental change. People in our lifetime, especially the youth, a certain element feel that if you're provocative, if you go out and do acts of damage, you'll get attention. Yeah, you'll get attention, but it's going to be negative media attention in the corporate media. We don't have the media. We never needed the media in history to make fundamental change. The revolution will not be televised, the great African-American artist told us. But we do need to create our own media. We have the core with Democracy Now! And all of the other wonderful independent media, your fantastic program on CFUV. This is all we need. But we do need to connect people, and the first step to connecting people to independent media is through transformative organizations, where people will learn that they're missing something in life by not hearing the truth about the resistance movements throughout the world that we have access to in independent media. But we first have to bring them in person. That means a personal connection, a personal contact.
Well, if Gil Scott-Heron, in his mentioning that the revolution will not be televised, I don't know if he envisioned a world where every person with a cell phone was a TV studio, but I think we might get some of it. But you mentioned, of course, McCarthyism. Now, McCarthyism, the Great Red Scare of the 1950s, where the phony populist Joseph McCarthy, the Senator Joe McCarthy, used it to terrify Washington primarily, but also media hubs and the entertainment industry as well. Today, we hear the term that green is the new red, with environmentalists being scapegoated as terrorists, and this war of terror, or war against terror, as they would more properly have it, being the excuse to practice what looks very much like a proto-McCarthyism. The NSA scandal that's currently going on, the National Security Agency scandal under Mr. Obama's administration, although not initiated by it, makes me wonder, how ready people are to sign up. Do you get reaction when you come up with your clipboard and say, do you want to do you want to join something, where people say, well, I would, but I don't want to be on CSIS list or, put in a computer file.
There's less fear about that because within the bus rider context, bus rider union organizing, they know they're being shafted, and they know something needs doing about it. So the first thought on their mind is not the fear. There's fear about some weirdo like me going up and saying, can I have your name and number and email and mobile phone number? Yes, there is that concern. But for every 10 that has that concern, 1 signs up. Okay, let me not exaggerate yet. It's about 1 in 50 at this point. Mm-hmm. That's where we start. If that's where we're at, that's where we start. And when enough bus riders over the next 1 to 10 years of systematic organizing see that, my goodness, my fellow bus riders are signing up with this organization, let me give it a try. And that's how the snowball effect, the exponential growth effect begins. But because of McCarthyism and because of the rise of the prison industrial complex, in the vacuum of not having transformative organizing, people are justifiably fearful of whatever looks like activism, but we have not invoked the personal connection element in our lifetime. After the 50s, Michael Parenti in the book Black Shirts and Reds identified how after the 10 years of McCarthyism, 1 million people were purged from the unions. These were the most conscious organizers. They knew the tactics and skills and had the experience of how to organize people, how to go up to people, listen to their hearts, not just give an intellectual rant, and see where people are at and respond in ways that are meaningful to people. And sign them up into the organizations that existed in the 30s. Eric Mann studied the role of the Communist Party when it was relevant, when it was not a dogmatic and hamstrung organization because of what happened internationally and domestically. It was a very effective organization in signing up multiracial working class people, men and women, people of all colors.
I imagine that's the most dangerous thing to a state intent on total control, is people coming together, especially across racial lines and religious lines as well. I'm rereading the great Kurt Vonnegut, the great American novelist Kurt Vonnegut's Jailbird, which is one of my favorite novels of all time. And in it, he talks, his characters in it were communists in the time of the 1930s during the Depression, and he says, well, it just seemed perfectly normal that somebody facing the Depression would join a party that was for the people. But years later, under McCarthy, that was drug out. The past was brought up to terrify people, to rob them of their livelihoods and any future they might have at great distress. Today, under this NSA that we were mentioning, the National Security Agency's program of taping telephone calls without warrant, they seem to be doing something quite similar, where creating the fear that anything that you might have said maybe years ago, well, it's possible that they can dredge it up sometime in the future and destroy any prospects that you might have for employment or anything else. Maybe even land you in prison for charges that weren't illegal at the time but have become so after the fact.
The prison industrial complex is the beginning of fascism, obviously. Our task now is to push it back, shut it down. That's the role of prison abolition work, and reinvest in preventing social deviant behavior, which is not why the prison industrial complex exists. It exists as a population and social control force to prevent progress, to prevent meaningful nonviolent resistance among working people.
And to marginalize racial minorities that through marijuana laws, for example.
Everything. All the marginalization, the war on drugs, the war against poverty, the war against dissent, it's all incipient and inherent in the existence of the prison industrial complex. So as free activists of privilege, it's really, really important, and so grateful that you're bringing it up, Chris, that we begin to educate our fellow activists of privilege to show them that the prison is there for the reasons you're highlighting. And if we're going to make progress, we have to begin to focus on the most fundamental of, well, everybody in prison is a victim. 90% of people in prison are poor. The majority are white people, but disproportionately there are people of color because of the racism. So one woman on Democracy Now! Or a YouTube I saw the other night said, the prisons are the new slavery. Therefore, we have to have an abolitionist approach, as Angela Davis teaches us. And we have leaders in prison, the most conscious, the most compassionate, the most committed, the most visionary of our people, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Leonard Peltier, up to 3,000 other people in prison. Bradley Manning, this man has a vision second to none. And it behooves us to at least sign those online petitions and send an email, get on the email list, make the phone calls into the Pentagon, into our representatives to demand Bradley Manning's freedom. And eventually connecting all of the people in prison. There are many political prisoners, at least 3,000 are political. And again, back to Mumia Abu-Jamal and Leonard Peltier being the political prisoners. Now the profound Edward Snowden. And of course, abroad, we have Julian Assange and all the people in prisons in states throughout the world, whether it's Russia, China, but most prisons are in capitalist states. And we know that the United States has the greatest proportion of imprisonment in the land of the free. And Canada under Harper clearly wants to take us in that direction. So we've got to, as we do our regular activism, we've got to point to the prison and say that institution has got to be shut down, and do little meaningful acts in that regard.
Well, when you mention Mumia Abu-Jamal or Leonard Peltier, I mean, their cases suspect in their conduct, the trials for certain. Their immense prison sentences, also a matter of some longer than Nelson Mandela, for example, spent in prison. But my favorite right now is Tim DeChristopher, whose case had nothing to do with violence. The guy went to what turned out to be an illegal auction of public lands and did nothing but hold up a bidder's paddle and make a phony bid, which he later said, well, he could raise money to actually buy the lands, which was disallowed. But he just finished serving almost 2 years in a federal prison in atrocious conditions, as all political prisoners face in America, and as you mentioned, Canada too soon. Larry, I mean, I mentioned at the introduction that you came from the United States some years ago. I wonder, Larry, why did you leave the United States, and do you find that maybe the United States is catching up to you here in Canada?
In a way I never anticipated. I'm in exile, only because of my privilege. My good family helped me emigrate, and my professional work background. I came for cleaner air. I always knew there were trees and cleaner air in Victoria compared to Los Angeles, and I had a dream of emigrating one day. And after I came here, it dawned on me how privilege allows people to move freely throughout the world, whereas working class refugees get rammed into the face of the Immigration and Naturalization Service in the U.S. and Canada's Jason Kenney, who want to send all people who can't contribute meaningfully back to society and by their definition become good little mall consumers with grand incomes. If they can't do that, then they deserve to be sent back, or if they can't sneak in and join the cheap labor force to become Canadian essentially slaves, new day slaves in Canada, then they get sent home. So I had the privilege to be able to transcend all that, and I had the great fortune to be able to emigrate. And I didn't realize, I came here with a lot of naive notions about how there's so many colonial aspects to Canada, and we've got to get to work.
Well, you're not alone in being naive. I think Canadians know the least about their country at all, and you have that great advantage of coming from somewhere else where you can look at Canada in a way that Canadians don't often tend to. And of course, you didn't mention the guest worker program, another import from abroad, which institutionalizes injustice, in my view at least. And that seems to be the model that this country is headed in. We know how much in the States the economy depends on the so-called illegal labor force. So they, in Canada, have taken the next step of just legalizing it, but managing to keep it marginalized at the same time.
Absolutely. The guest worker program is reflective of, as you mentioned at the outset, casualization and precariousness of labor. And again, when we organize, when we relearn how to organize, and I can't impress upon disparate activism in our city and throughout North America, how important it is to learn what organizing requires in a very meaningful and concrete way. Then all of these symptoms, we will begin to create the power to reverse the symptoms and see that capitalism itself is going to generate poisonous symptom after symptom until we begin to think about an alternative social economic order.
Now, you mentioned fresh air, but we haven't really touched on some of your environmental activism. The political sometimes seems to be trivial as compared to the kinds of environmental issues that we face in 2013, let alone what we're going to face in the coming years if these trends continue. What do you think is the most important environmental issue that we're faced with today?
Climate change and cancer, the epidemic of cancer from all the industrial poisons. And they require, again, they need to be connected. The struggles to get off carbon. We could do it in 6 months to 2 years once we get the political alignment of forces that can leverage the resources, the $1 trillion that we need to get off carbon. It can happen in a short time, but it has to be connected to working class-based organizing, transformative organizing of the working class. And again, the Bus Riders Union model points the way to make the grand linkages between preventing ecological catastrophe and eventually healing the planet, while assuring that people who are forced into the work economy that is so carbon dependent eventually have the means to transition, and this is called the just transition, to protect jobs and the environment, preventing the pitting of the two necessary struggles against each other. The just transition to protect jobs and the environment will come out of a transformative organizing process so that workers will eventually have the political power to make the demands that we don't want to destroy the planet that our livelihoods depend on, and we want to be guaranteed economic security as we transform our workplaces into ecologically sensitive work and our neighborhoods into sustainable neighborhoods.
Well, we in British Columbia, Canada generally, but British Columbia especially, are well familiar with the divide and conquer tactics of pitting the economy against the environment. And it strikes me that we're getting to a point where the economy needs the environment, and that definitely is a model that has to be struck down.
We know that you can't have a thriving economy on a dead planet. But Christy Crunch benefits from the increasing death of the planet and her investors and her financial backers. So they're not going to give up on their profit machine just because the logic of preserving Mother Nature is eminently clear to the majority. We've got to, again, be in organizations that eventually, I envision the day when general strikes will make ecological demands when enough people are in unions again. And they'll say, we want better wages and benefits and working conditions, but we don't want to produce trash that destroys, that gives us cancer and only ends up in the malls and the landfills. This is not meaningful work, and we demand in our contract to transform our assembly lines and manufacturing processes to make things that heal the planet. And incorporating this idea that comes from a great new book called Green Illusions, that we cannot produce our way out of the ecological crisis. We don't have to produce new technology. In fact, we need to actively work against production of most new technology. Yeah, we'll need some solar energy and some wind power, but more importantly, the idea that we need infrastructure shifts, social infrastructure. Again, the buses are a critical point of preventing ecological catastrophe, just because of the much higher efficiency of buses for getting people around. And conservation. We need to have millions of workers paid livable wages to put insulation into our buildings, greenhouse the south side in the northern hemisphere of all buildings so they can generate their own heat, put up breadbasket water heaters to heat our water. And yeah, we'll need to have solar photovoltaic cells to produce electricity, but fundamentally we need to profoundly cut back on the amount of electricity. And one significant thing that will help cut back on the consumption of energy will be a dramatic reduction in the work week. We work 2 days a week for ourselves, the other 3 days a week are for the exploiters in this capitalist system of the world. So the effective work week is only 2 days. We need much more leisure time. And that will ease the burden on carbon consumption dramatically.
Yeah, so an electric car in every garage isn't going to cut it.
No, thank you. Green Illusions shows how the electric car is a profound myth and a delusion. Yeah, an electric-based car system doesn't save any more carbon than an automobile and than a fossil fuel-based car system. But we need free public transit.
Well, you mentioned the Premier, not by her more usual name, but in British Columbia, we've got some very profound changes going on and have been going on, and always around energy production. The fracked gas is an issue that that a lot of, or at least prominent environmentalists, citing global warming as their sole, it seems to me at least, their sole interest, are not opposing, as opposed to the tar sands, for example, but allowing that British Columbia ruin its water supply, fracking gas, and also creating vast dams to create more electricity, not designed for people, but designed for, as it turns out, the tar sands.
Yeah. So we know the NDP is wedded because of the sad connection to the need to get in office, get enough votes to get in office, and then once you're in office, to pay that welfare base through fossil fuel and clear-cut royalty systems, essentially. So the only way that's ever going to change, and the Green Party's got this one correct, is again through transformative organizing, where we have people independently organizing, independent of political parties, who can eventually push the political parties and open up the door to proportional representation, which bring in the Green Party by demanding that our politicians, transformative organizing, once we have political power, enough people, in other words, in our organizations, will exert enough pressure on the political system to open the door to proportional representation. And then we'll see the possibility of making more ecological demands, stopping fracking, stopping Site C dam, getting off any kind of carbon. Natural gas, we know, is a farce. It's no solution at all. It sounds clean, but that's just the way, because they've been able to spin it in their own corporate media. We need a massive investment. We need to shut down as quickly as possible all fossil fuel and put that capital into genuine sustainability, carbon-free sustainability, and conservation.
Well, there's upstream and downstream, and in Victoria now there's a huge issue of what we do with our waste. And one of the models, because it's been going not untreated as some of the reports indicate, but our treated sewage waste has been going out into the ocean. That's been deemed not good enough, but they've decided to have a secondary treatment plants built, which seem problematic in many different ways environmentally as well, not to mention the vast amounts of money that they will demand. What's your take on Victoria's plan, Larry, to build this rather standard system of sewage treatment and sludge creation and then dissemination?
We should not be putting it into the backyard of the lowest income community, Esquimalt. That's unjust. We need a democratic process. I'm proud of the people who marched against it, 200 strong the other day. But we do need to treat our sewage. Sewage is carbon. All the water system that took all the fossil fuel to get it into the sea, it's soil, it's topsoil. That's ultimately what sewage is. And we're actually eroding topsoil by letting it go into the sea. So we need to reclaim the biosolid, treat it appropriately, have poison and what's called poison and carcinogen and contaminant abolition. Nothing should be put in our sewage supply that harms our bodies, and that's called source point control, holding the corporations completely responsible to getting the poisons, the pharmaceuticals, and all the contaminants out of the waste stream.
Well, is that possible when people are, taking their birth control is going into the sewage system and ending up in the environment, any manner of antibiotics and God knows what else, and the heavy metals?
And they can treat it all.
Yeah?
Yeah, there's systems that can treat it all with high-tech carbon. But you can't just wait till it gets to the end point. You have to ultimately hold the producers responsible for putting that crap in. Again, the pharmaceuticals are an issue that requires some thinking about. But carbon will get pharmaceuticals out of the waste streams. So we're going to have tertiary treatment systems throughout the world. Again, if we didn't have massive amounts of military spending, we could get these systems up and running in no time. That would clean up our water supply and then ultimately stop the production of the poisons. And that's where carcinogen abolition based on the precautionary principle comes into play. Getting anything that, not waiting to see how many dead bodies we have from the poisons in our environment. David Suzuki went to the doctor. They found 200 poisons in his blood. He related to the fact that these poisons are all throughout any living cell anywhere in the world.
Yeah, we see the children being born, they're already polluted in the womb, and which I guess is obvious because the mothers are as well. It's funny when you talk about militarism, not many people make the connection between or at least the environmental impact of militarism. And I know the United States is something, almost half of their carbon consumption is actually done by the military.
Half?
Almost half.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, this is a fascist society. That's what Hitler understood he was implementing, and the paymakers of Hitler. The total confluence between the military, the inseparability between the civilian capitalist sector and the military-industrial complex.
And it's mainstream economics.
Yeah.
In the United States and increasingly here in Canada as well.
Yeah. But let's not focus on the doom and gloom. A great friend of mine, Joe Wheeler, says, ain't it awful? Too many times we have a tendency to focus on the ain't it awful and lament and shake our heads without seeing the pathway out of it. And the pathway out of it is what happened in the 30s.
Well, today, now, what resources can our listeners and viewers, what resources do you recommend that they can go to so that they don't sit there shaking their fists at their television sets or their computer screens, as the case may be? What do you suggest that they do to get activated and get beyond that ain't it awful stage?
Thank you, Chris. We need more musicians and people who know how to bring on the beer and the food to have a lot of fun in this long struggle. SocialEnvironmentalAlliance.org is the website of our new Transformative Organizing network in Victoria.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Larry Wartel, for coming on. It's been a great pleasure to speak to you and to interview you after all these years of seeing you at all these functions and meetings. And thank you, too, for watching Face to Face, and do stay tuned for more programming coming up.